we're just all human beings on the same planet. That is the initial connection between all of us.
Die großen Probleme dieser Welt, Armut, Hunger, Umweltkatastrophen, Klimawandel und ähnliche, lassen sich nur gemeinsam lösen.
Ce qui est sûr, c'est que il y a une partie du monde qui va mal.
We have disparities between the rich and the poor in different levels of education and employment, but there is hope.
I worry about the migrant population. I do work for a children's association where there are migrant children. What will become of them when they're 19, 20, 25?
We've fought for so many rights, but if we are not careful, we'll go back in a heartbeat.
Aujourd'hui, j'ai beaucoup d'empathie et j'ai des enfants et je me demande quel type de société nous allons léguer à nos enfants, aux futures générations.
Ce que je dis à mes enfants, c'est surtout l'éducation. Je leur dis que moi, je n'ai pas d'héritage financier à leur donner, mais j'ai un capital d'éducation à leur donner qui sera un passeport international, universel pour eux.
حلمي بشكل عام عني وعن عائلتي إنه أرجع التقى فيهم وكون بجانبهم لما عم كون الأسرة الخاصة فيني.
What makes me happy is other people that are happy, my family, Legos, my friends.
I love dancing because dance is joy. When someone gets up to dance, it means they are feeling happy.
آرزوی بزرگ ما میخواد بود که یک روز ما ببینم در کشور ما صلح هست، امنیت هست، فقر بیچارگی نیست دیگه، مردم حقوقش برش رسیدگی میشه.
Estabilidad, seguridad, confianza, tolerancia. El sentido económico no es muy importante. Lo que cuenta más es el sentirse bien.
Aujourd'hui, voilà, la parole est décomplexée à cause d'Internet. Peu importe d'où l'on vient, on peut créer quelque chose, on peut créer une application, créer un nouveau jeu, un nouveau média et faire entendre sa voix. Et donc ça, c'est beau.
I used to think that I was the only little black girl with a disability. There are thousands and thousands who are online who also grew up thinking the same thing, who now can connect with one another because of technology, and that's incredible.
Et c'est dans les moments où on est face à des problèmes, des challenges, c'est les moments dans lesquels on va se retourner le plus souvent vers d'autres personnes et où on va vraiment apprécier la valeur des personnes qui nous entourent en fait.
On se pose des questions. On se dit, bon, ben, si on veut travailler tous dans le même sens et si certains commencent à baisser les bras, est-ce qu'on va y arriver?
C'est quand les pays travaillent ensemble que finalement les citoyens peuvent travailler ensemble et permettent en fait de construire des choses à impact beaucoup plus fort partout dans le monde, parce qu'aujourd'hui en fait tout le monde est interconnecté.
Acho que deve haver senso de comunidade entre os países, na qual eles reservam e dedicam parte do seu tempo e esforços por bem comum.
I tell world leaders to do better for your own citizens, do better for other citizens. Just think of other people before you think of yourself.
¿Qué puede haber cambiado en mí desde que llegué de Guatemala, aquí en Francia? Ha cambiado en mí la tolerancia, la paciencia, la mirada hacia los otros, la comprensión, esperar, saber respirar en la vida.
Good morning, and thanks everyone for making it down here so early, especially if you were enjoying the forum dinner or some extracurricular networking drinks last night. It's great to have you with us. I'm Josh Lowe. I'm Deputy Editor of Apolitical. We're a platform for public servants around the world. If you're a public servant interested in sharing ideas with your peers elsewhere, reading about policy that's working, do check us out. Sign up if you're interested. We're here today to talk about new global leadership, which is quite a grand phrase, but what does it mean? Well, probably here in the audience at this discussion, certainly here at the forum, we have representatives from a range of different sectors. Some of you, if you're here representing governments or political parties or multilateral organizations like the OECD, are part of a class of global leaders who've led the public conversation for some time, for decades or even centuries in some cases. Others of you, if you're here from the private sector or the third sector, may have seen your role in public life change in recent years or grow. Private sector CEOs in particular have been taking a much more prominent position recently, opining and sometimes achieving real progress on issues ranging from migration to climate change. And I think in the Edelman Trust Barometer, business is now trusted more than government. So is it a good thing that non-government actors are getting louder in the public debate? Should we see more of it? Or do we risk undermining the many good things that government brings to the table? And how, in a world where the boundaries between public and private are increasingly blurred, can different sectors collaborate to tackle global challenges? So, big questions. We'll get down to discussing them. I'm just going to briefly introduce our panel here. I'll introduce each of them. I've also asked each of them to tell me one surprising fact about themselves that wasn't in their biography. So hopefully we'll all learn something new about each other today. On my far left, we have Denis Machuel, Chief Executive Officer of Sodexo, the services company. One thing you don't know about him, he practices mindfulness meditation. So go up and ask him if you're feeling stressed after the session. Here to my immediate left, we have Paul Novak, Deputy General Secretary of the Trade Union Congress, which is the national organisation for British trade unions. He tells me that alongside his day job, he plays in a ukulele band. They've played the Cavern Club, at which some band called the Beatles once played, apparently. They've also played the world's northernmost ukulele festival, so ask him if you're interested in ukulele music. Frédéric Roder is France Director at One, a campaigning and advocacy organisation taking action to end extreme poverty and preventable disease. Surprising fact about her, she went to her first demonstration at 16 and made it into a prison cell for a few hours, but she wants me to make it very clear charges weren't upheld. Her record is completely clean. And finally, Alex Romero Gallego is the CEO and founder of Alto Data Analytics. He set up his first business at 11 years old. He says it was an illegal business, but he didn't actually realize that at the time. He copied video games, he employed 12 people, and then boring regulations stepped in the form of his parents, and he was shut down. So a salutary lesson in the dangers of red tape at an early age. So to turn to each of our panel with a brief introductory question. And Denis, if I can come to you first. One thing we're touching on today is CEOs taking on new public leadership roles historically reserved for politicians. As a CEO who's worked alongside government, how do you see your role in the public debate?
Thanks, Josh. And well, I think it's not only the CEO, of course, it's the company that we represent. And, as a global company, we have to raise our voice. Sodexo is a global company with a global impact, but the global impact that happens locally. We employ 450,000 people across the world. We serve 100 million consumers, improving their quality of life, serving seniors in their homes, serving children in the schools, serving workers in remote sites. And, as we do so, we, of course, have an impact that happens locally in our 35,000 sites across the world. And, because we think that we have a positive impact while we improve the quality of life of the people, we think that we have to raise our voice because raising our voice is, of course, stating our case. It's also being an ambassador, is embracing the cause of our employees, embracing the cause of our clients, embracing the cause of this worker in a remote site, embracing the cause of the patients we serve in the hospitals, embracing the cause of our suppliers, embracing the cause of the local communities with whom we interact. And as we typically, if I give an example, when we speak out on food safety, food safety is very close to our hearts with the business that we do. A lot of our business is serving food to people. And when we raise our voice on food safety, we believe that we help improve food safety overall. So it's a cause that makes sense. When we raise our voice on diversity and inclusion, which is very close to our hearts, and we really strive to be exemplary, we think that we help society make progress. Same thing for local communities and local businesses. So all those things, I think, are the responsibility of a company in participating to the local debate and make things progress.
Thank you very much for that. I should say, actually, I also neglected to say at the start, you can, we'll have a Q&A at the end, but you can also submit questions via the event app or via the web. You've got a little card on your seats that looks something like this. I will see questions if you send them on my second iPad down here. It's a very digital discussion, and I might have a chance to raise some of those questions if you send them. But thank you very much for that, Denis, and I'm going to bring in Paul now, because Paul, as a trade unionist, you may have had somewhat different dealings with business leaders in your time than some other members of the panel. Should we be skeptical about the idea that some people say, and that I mentioned in the introduction, that CEOs and others from the private sector are somehow kind of more in touch with the public or have as much to give in these debates as politicians do?
I absolutely do think we should be skeptical. That's not to say that there isn't a role for business leaders in public life. There clearly is, or to say there isn't a role for responsible businesses thinking about their impact in terms of wider stakeholders, the impact on the environment and so on. But I've got three probably initial concerns about us almost, if you like, amplifying the role of CEOs or business leaders in terms of global leadership. I think the first one is legitimacy. I mean, one of the things that is apparent is that there is a growing gap, I think, between, if you like, the shop floor and the boardroom. The CBI, which is the UK's business organisation, published a report at the end of last year. 69% of the British public feel that company bosses are out of touch with the lives of ordinary working people. There is a growing gap in terms of income between Britain's boardrooms and workers more generally. We've had the biggest squeeze on wages in the UK since the Napoleonic Wars over the last 10 years, but CEO pay has continued to go up and up. And we've also been hit by a wave of corporate scandals, whether that's BHS or we've just recently had in the UK Carillion, the collapse of a company, potential impact on 20,000 people's direct livelihoods as well as the supply chain and so on. So I'm a little bit sceptical that the chief executive is the man, and it is normally a man, and that's the second point I'm going to make, in touch with the average man and woman on the street. I think there is another point about diversity, because I think diverse leadership teams are important in companies, in trade unions, but also globally as well. I mean, it's a simple fact of life that there are more men called Dave and Steve in the FTSE 100 chief executive cohort than there are women. There are only 5 black and ethnic minority chief executives in the FTSE 100. I think we need to be doing more to create diverse leadership teams. And I worry that if we go down this road of a central role for the CEO, that what we're doing is reaffirming the existing leadership structures, a relatively close circle of people with similar backgrounds and similar education and so on. I think the third point that really important for me is just, I mean, the starting point, your questions you ask almost assumes that business doesn't already have a central role in global leadership. And I'd argue actually that businesses, and we'll see it at the forum here this week, have a very central role in terms of lobbying government, influencing government, can afford, have the resources to be able to do that effectively, can afford to second people into government positions, can afford to fund political parties. All legitimate activity, but I think it's important that we amplify the voices of other stakeholders. So crucially, stakeholders who can empower citizens. Trade unions, I think, are a central role in that, but other civic society organisations as well. So yes, a role for business, yes, a role for CEOs, but let's amplify the voice of other stakeholders as well, and let's make sure that they're on an equal footing if we're serious about supporting and enhancing our democratic institutions.
Great, well, thanks, Paul. Already some debate opening up in the panel. That's good. That's what we like to hear of a Wednesday morning. Frédéric, we've been talking so far about the kind of private sector, about government. You're here kind of representing broadly the third sector, although I know we were talking before, you slightly want to move beyond some of this terminology. But you know, the kinds of organizations you represent are crucial on many global challenges. Do you ever feel like their role is going under-recognized? And what does global leadership look like in your sector?
I mean, first of all, I wanted to say that I think 2 years ago, no one would actually have believed that we have to hold a global forum at the OECD that calls for the need for more multilateral action. So I think we're definitely in a very interesting time where it's more pertinent than ever to discuss new global leadership. And because I think we can't take anything for granted any longer, I'm starting with stating the obvious, which is that today's global challenges won't be solved single-handedly by governments or businesses or civil society. And this is also what I meant by we need to go beyond the sectors. I think there's a role for everyone, and actually the thing that will really allow us to have a step change in multilateral action and in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals will actually be the partnerships that go beyond the sectors, the first, the second, the third. We also now have the fourth. I think we need to go beyond that. But to come back to your question more precisely is, yesterday I was here at the Civil Society Forum, and the OECD put the question to civil society. They asked us to actually think about what we would do differently, we civil society, if we were at the core of the multilateral system. So first of all, I would argue that we are already at the core of the multilateral system. I mean, of course, I would want civil society to play a more important role, but we must face the fact that actually much of the progress that has been made in the past has been made thanks to civil society. I mean, not exclusively, but also thanks to civil society. So for instance, I was mentioning the Sustainable Development Goals, the most ambitious set of objectives we've ever set ourselves as an international community. This only came about because of civil society pressure and citizen participation. The Paris Agreement is another good example, the International Criminal Court, and so on. And today we're facing a situation, as I said, I wouldn't have seen this coming 2 years ago, where we really have to defend the multilateral system. And I think one conclusion should actually be to strengthen further the role of citizens in multilateral processes. I think that while maybe our governments are agreeing on less and less things, this is where citizens should play actually a bigger role, and I really like the video at the beginning, right? We may have more in common than we actually think. I think there are some models, as I said, we had processes where civil society was actually already taking an active part in the past, but I do think that we also need now to disrupt a little bit the processes and think about new ways of coming together and not just, as I said, not just for civil society, but for all actors.
Great, and in that answer, and I think in some ways in all three so far, we've heard a lot about kind of broadening out this question of leadership and helping people beyond just the top levels of these various sectors take control and do more, which makes it an opportune time to bring in Alex. At Alto Data Analytics, you've got your ear to the ground, as it were, on the wider public responses to big debates, what technologies they use to respond to these things. So what's the potential for ordinary individuals to lead the way and to inspire global change?
Well, definitely, you know, being in this talk, you know, new global leadership made me think about why are we talking about this? And it's basically because I think we all feel there are new challenges and there is new leadership needed. And so we see in our analysis when we analyze, for example, you know, activism, citizens, we see how there are new routes for their voice to be heard, mostly through technology, digital technologies. which is very important. And there are new ways also for the citizens to provide social license to government, politicians, but also to companies around what they are, willing to see. We recently published with the World Economic Forum an analysis about sustainability in the US. We mapped the debate, the public debate there. We analyzed 73 million data points. And it was very, very evident that there was a high politicization and polarization of the debate, but it was ordinary people, citizens, that were very influential and sometimes leading the debate. For example, around the Flint clean water crisis issue in the US, or around climate change and the new policy from the US government. So, definitely, the digital transformation is also happening in civil society. There are new routes for citizens and ordinary people to exercise influence, to find allies, to raise their voice. And we see that in every single analysis we do about issues and themes. And this is changing the way leadership needs to be exercised. And that's why I think it fits very nicely into this chat today.
So I'd like to turn back first to this question of CEOs and business leaders and their new roles, because it struck me recently watching Mark Zuckerberg in his various parliamentary performances, that this is a man who has taken on perhaps a much more kind of public role and in some ways a more political role than he maybe envisaged for himself when he was in his dorm room however many years ago, and in some ways has been maybe slightly surprised by that, has had to respond to it in interesting ways. So my question is, if business and if the private sector wants to take on more responsibilities and platforms that were kind of traditionally assigned to politicians, what new responsibilities in terms of accountability, in terms of social responsibility, other things, should we expect from them? What's the kind of contract there? And I'd like to come back to Alex maybe first on this one.
Thank you. Because of our work, so I want to share with you my very personal views on this. Because of our work, we deal with a lot of multilaterals and large organizations. We have a good C-level access. And what I see in terms of CEOs and the C-level in a lot of the companies we work for is that they're suffering from a high level of specialization. So they're very good in the energy sector. They understand and know their business very well. But we are in an era of change, and I think we need I always say that we are facing a new renaissance in which the issues are so complex that you need really different minds altogether. We need more Leonardos that approach the global issues that we have in a very holistic way. So I think that the first issue that I see is that the type of talent and the way that the organizations are set up in businesses need to change to have a more holistic view of the issues. Coming to your example of Facebook, I don't think, this is my very personal opinion, but I don't think there was any bad intent in some of the things that happened. But what it's clear to me is that there was probably not the best team put together in order to understand the social impact of a platform, for example. And that's why I think that, especially when you are running a business that is sitting on top of data of 2 billion people, you need to bring different backgrounds and skill sets in order to understand the social implications of that. I think more and more civil society is realizing that. I think more and more we will realize also that the highly specialized education we are all getting, it's probably not enough, and that a lot of things need to change, not only at a business levels, but also at a government levels, regulation, and educational levels.
So it's partly about kind of having the right team around you, people who understand the world in maybe a different way than business leaders have needed thus far. I know Paul was kind of itching to respond to this one, so I'll come to you next.
Yeah, I mean, I think if business leaders and the companies they lead are going to play a more central role in public life, I think they have to be serious about accountability and about transparency. I've maybe put 3 issues onto the table. One is about being good corporate citizens. So if you want to roll in the public discourse and in policy making and influence in politics, then you should pay your taxes, you should pay your workers a living wage, you should do right by environmental standards. And we all too often see companies playing a little bit fast and loose in terms of the broad CSR statements. But if you're going to play that role in the public discourse, I think you need to be a good corporate citizen, if you like. I think the second thing is about corporate governance, and this varies in different countries, have different structures for corporate governance, but certainly the sort of scandals that I talked about before, I think you mitigate the impact of those sorts of things when you have other voices in the boardroom. I'm particularly interested in workers on boards, and there are different ways of doing that. Lots of European countries have that sort of system. We don't have it in the UK. But actually, again, this is about shining a light into the boardroom, and also, I would say directly, the people that we represent having a view on the big strategic decisions that impact upon their working lives. And I think the third thing is about commitment to that broader social dialogue, because again, we need checks and balances in any system. We know our democracies are imperfect, but it's about the best system that we've got. And I actually think democracy is more than just people casting the vote once every 4 or 5 years. It is about active social dialogue. And so, yes, if there is going to be that role for companies and for business leaders, there needs to be that role for civic society, for trade unions, for other stakeholders as well.
Denis, as a CEO yourself, a representative of that class, as it were, do you feel that the kind of pressure of increased public accountability? What's your take on this?
Well, I think accountability for a CEO goes much beyond accountability on the bottom line and on the share price. And I think the CEOs who would feel only accountable for those 2 elements put their company in trouble. But let me give you just one background on Sodexo that highlights why it's deeply rooted, well, this global perspective is deeply rooted. Our founder, Pierre Bellon, in 1968, there were some things happening in Paris at that time, right? But in 1968, at that time, he had founded the company 2 years before, and he was the president of the Federation of Young Entrepreneurs. And he said in a convention, he said, the company is not the company. The company is a community of its clients, its employees, and its shareholders. We're talking 50 years back. It's a concept that today is more and more embraced by more and more people. At that time, that was visionary. And when you say that, you set the tone for who you are and for the accountability that you have towards your ecosystem, the accountability that you have towards your employees. You know, we employ 450,000 people. Most of them have not a very high qualification. And, our fundamental accountability towards our employees is how do we provide them a future? How do we provide them, the world is being disrupted. Automation comes in, robotics comes in. What is the impact for our workers, for our employees? It's our responsibility to ensure that they learn. So in responsibility and, of course, accountability. We have a responsibility towards our clients, of course, and they remind us and that's, I would say, that's the easy part, because they remind us that if we're not rightly accountable, we lose them. We have a responsibility towards, of course, our consumers. And it's true that inmates in a prison, when we serve them, they might not be able to walk away. But consumers want more and more personal services, and if they don't like what we provide, if they think that we don't behave as they would like, they'll walk away as well. We have a responsibility towards our suppliers. And typically, just to give you an example, we believe that helping small and medium businesses, being a big corporation is fundamental to create a sustainable economy. We've committed, and we are almost reaching there, that we would provide 1 billion revenue to 5,000 local small and medium business suppliers, 1/3 of them being owned and run by women. And we believe that it's part of our accountability, and we are fine to be judged on that. And it's true also for local communities. We are accountable for, when we work in the mining sector, with our big mining clients. We are accountable for the impact that we have, for engaging with local communities, for helping them profit from this economic activity that happens locally. And so I think CEOs are now more and more accountable towards more and more stakeholders. Even financial markets, I think, ask more and more accountability to companies and to CEOs, typically on sustainable goals. And I think it's a very good thing. It's a very good thing, because it takes us away from share price and bottom line. So, you know, I can tell you I feel accountable every second of my life. Huh?
There we go. Well, I suppose we should be thankful for that. And Frederic, this is, of course, not just a problem for business. It's also an issue for the third sector, for charities, this issue of accountability, of being sort of transparent towards those you serve. Did you have any thoughts on this before we move on?
Definitely. I mean, I was the first one to say that we do need every actor around the table, and that we won't be able to solve global challenges without, for instance, the business on board. And at the same time, we shouldn't forget that the primary purpose of a business, at least the second sector, businesses is profit. So yes, I mean, CEOs can do the right thing. They can transform the business model of their company. They can have the right team, I mean, around them, consulting them. But in the end, I think we need to keep this in mind, and this is where obviously the role of governments come in. While it's important that we're discussing new types of global leadership, this doesn't mean that the responsibility of governments will decrease, quite to the contrary. And this is, of course, also true for other sectors, including civil society, right? We also need regulation. And when we're asking for transparency, like we've done it, for instance, here in France, then of course, once the law comes into effect, we of course also have to comply with that law and are complying with the same transparency regulations as, for instance, lobbyists. That's totally normal. But I really think that this is really important to keep in mind for that discussion, especially because we don't have a government representative here at the panel. And why this is important as well is that why multi-stakeholder partnerships can go a long way, why we need business solutions for some of the global challenges. There are also lots of challenges that won't be met by businesses. And especially the issues we work on, so the fight against extreme poverty. To give you just one figure is that today in Niger, there are only 17% of young women who can write and read. 17, so 17, this means that 83% of a whole generation of women can't read and write. No business is going to provide a solution for that. And also, I mean, what we can add here, especially at the OECD, is that, of course, the Niger government can't do it alone neither. The other reason why we need regulation and a strong role of governments in the public sector is that progress is urgently needed. The Sustainable Development Goals deadline is 2030, which is more or less tomorrow. And we know that we're probably off track today, 3 years only after actually adopting those goals. So we urgently need to get back on track. And this is also where governments, I think, have a role to play in setting milestones and in creating the right incentive structures for the different actors to work together and to achieve those objectives. I mean, we already mentioned, for instance, the issue of boardrooms across the OECD world, right? I mean, gender has been an issue that we've been discussing for quite a while, and diversity in general. We know that progress is so slow that, I mean, I can't even remember, but I think we have at least 100 years to go or so until we achieve gender equality. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that we can't wait 100 years. I totally recognize that there are lots of people and actors that want to do the right thing. There are also a lot of actors that don't want to change. I think it's also in the interest of business actually to be regulated and for governments actually to set or to level the playing field, and level the playing field, of course, at a very high level, because, as I said, we can't wait.
And talking there about the role of government, you're right, we don't have anyone from government here to defend themselves, but we'll take it that you're a generous audience, and we'll kind of fill in some of those points. But Frédéric, you talked in your opening statement about kind of the importance of cross-sector collaboration. So we've just heard there from you about the importance of government's role in kind of regulation. But how can organizations like yours or businesses all kind of work together to tackle some of these challenges? Do you have any experiences of that you'd be interested in sharing, and what's the best kind of way to go about that?
Yeah, I mean, one very concrete example is that, so in 2015, the international community adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, which was a huge step forward. And at the same time, everyone was aware of the challenges, actually, first of all, to know where we were at in 2015, to have a proper baseline, actually, for all the goals. And then, of course, to be able actually to measure progress. I mean, if we can't measure it, we will never get there. So there was a huge data problem. And back then, and with different actors from across the sectors, including the OECD, we launched a partnership for a data revolution to be able actually to back up those sustainable development goals. And I think this is a very good example where it's pretty clear that one actor can't do it on its own, and that you need different types of actors coming together. So, for instance, the private sector actually detains lots of the data we need. It needs to inform public policies so that we're actually able to make progress, and at the same time civil society can help with analyzing the data, making the right proposals, and of course, if need be, put pressure on governments to do the right thing. I wouldn't say that there's probably not an ideal way to go about this, and this is good, because I do think, as I said, that we really need to innovate and that we probably don't have we don't have the magical bullet yet, which is good, but I think the importance is that we all agree that we need to go beyond the sectors and work hand in hand. I think the other area where we definitely need to make progress is to rethink a little bit the multilateral system. I mean, a little bit, a lot, and not just see civil society and actually it may actually be the same for businesses and other types of non-state actors, not just as someone who needs to be consulted at some point, and then you tick the box and you move on. But as I said, we really, I think, need to disrupt a little bit the system here and bring in non-state actors as real, actors in their full right to the table. There are some examples where we already went a little bit in that direction. I think we need to go much further. And I mean, we're in France. I do hope that the G7 presidency of France next year will be maybe a test case for that.
It strikes me, talking about the kind of humanitarian sector, there's a slight trend recently in businesses doing more to kind of help to serve humanitarian goals, not just through traditional sort of donations or corporate social responsibility, but often through their kind of core businesses. So I know MasterCard, for example, does a lot of stuff with financial products for refugees. I'm interested in your thoughts on that, Frédéric, but also Denis, interested in your thoughts on what role business can play in these sorts of humanitarian ends and what the limits of that should be.
Well, I think, those great causes cannot be solved only with one player, definitely. And you talked about earlier the accountability. I think the accountability of a CEO is to be open, is to be inclusive of other stakeholders of a different kind. Let me give you one example of one of the biggest scandals of our time is food waste. The food that is, 1/3 of the food that is produced on Earth is wasted. That means, and we have at the same time, almost 1 billion people who starve. This is a scandal. And you know, we see our role being, of course, in the food business as you know, an actor of change here. But we cannot do it alone. So what we've done, we've created with several players from the private sectors and others, the International Food Waste Coalition. We've started that with PepsiCo, with Unilever, and with the WWF to really look at how along the you know, food value chain from production to consumption, how we could really reduce food waste. And it takes a holistic or systemic view to achieve something. What's interesting here is when we started, very quickly, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, the FAO, just came in saying that they were very good in producing content to raise awareness, but they were having a hard time to deploy. And so they came along, and of course we were inclusive. We say, sure, help us, and to raise awareness typically towards children across the planet in schools on how they would behave with the food in their plate. So, and that's, of course, it requires to be open. It requires, because we are different animals, if I may say, government institutions, NGOs, etc. So we need to engage in a dialogue. We need to learn to work together, because we have different ways of working, different agendas. But if we align our agendas, we are efficient. Let me give you another example. In job insertion is critical in our business. We employ a lot of people. And we also, as I mentioned earlier, we employ people with low qualification for many of them. And we help them, so being a social elevator, we help them have a career. In India, we partner with an NGO, which is called Eco Kitchen. Eco Kitchen is an NGO that supports women in need, women that have that underwent violence at home, and they care for them and they train them, and they train them on skills that are of interest to us around cooking and serving food, etc. So, and we've been very efficient in partnering with that NGO to provide to these women jobs and a career. So that's typically elements where we think we help embrace good cause, humanitarian cause, and where we can be alone.
And I want to move on in a second to a very different kind of public-private collaboration, bring in Paul and Alex, but just very quickly, Frédéric, what are there any kind of limitations on this, on private sector involvement in humanitarian ends? How do we make sure that other sectors are represented and that their influence isn't overreaching?
I mean, first of all, I think the key term here is actually creating win-win situations. And I think this is happening more and more, where actually companies are changing their models, so it makes sense for them as well. And at the same time, we're actually able to achieve objectives of general interest. And it's also pretty obvious that the challenges today are as such that we need to rely on certain expertise that only the business has. And I think another good example is indeed like the digital revolution and the new opportunities this is opening up. But this, I think, for humanitarian causes or, I mean, any issue actually that you can pick is that this is, I mean, may sound like a broken record, but where regulation is needed, right? And just because something might actually tick the box of solving one humanitarian problem or one global public good problem, it shouldn't at the same time actually maybe undermining another one. And this is also why the Sustainable Development Agenda is so important, because it really recognizes this. We can't fight climate change in an effective way without fighting extreme poverty at the same time, without achieving gender equality, without putting an end to pandemics. And this makes things more complex, but this is also why we're coming together and why we all need all the actors around the table.
And moving on, Paul, in your introduction, you mentioned the recent collapse of Carillion, which, for anyone who doesn't know, was a big UK outsourcing company which went under to great kind of scandal and fanfare in the press. That's an example of where, while public-private collaboration can achieve great things, sometimes it has big risks. How do we make sure that public-private collaboration is to the good and is not kind of putting people in danger in that sort of way?
Well, in those, and funnily enough, me and Denny were just talking about some of these issues before we came in, but I think actually partly it's about government being a good client. Part of the problems we've seen in the UK outsourcing movement, UK outsourcing environment is that there's been a race to the bottom. You assess contracts purely on a value for money, in inverted commas basis, and that often means a race to the bottom in wages, a race to the bottom in terms of standards. Companies competing to secure market share and thinking it doesn't matter if we make a profit on this contract, we'll get the next one. And that's actually not a really good way to do business. And so we're very keen to make sure that there's a very live debate in the UK about how we get the balance right between the public and private sector, how we set the right sort of standards, how we do things like maintain job quality and service standards, because this matters to the people who ultimately receive those public services, whether it's an elderly parent getting care at home or whatever. I think more basically, Josh, I mean, my starting point is that those countries that foster social dialogue tend to do better in terms of the less unequal societies, and they're better equipped to meet some of the big challenges that we've been talking about, whether it's climate change or automation. And I have a sense of frustration, certainly from a UK perspective. We do some of this, but we don't follow things through. So just to give one very quick example, we're working with the government and the CBI, our employers' organisation at the moment, on something called a National Retraining Scheme. I don't often give a Conservative government credit, but I'll give them credit for this. Bringing together the social partners to think about how we reskill people in the face of increasing automation and digitalisation. That's important, but it's very ad hoc and it's very narrow, because I don't think you can address a question like the future of work without also talking about what does this mean for our social security systems? What does this mean for employment regulation? What does this mean in terms of how do we share the benefits of increased growth that would come with increased automation and digitalisation? And this stuff really matters, because at the one hand it seems like quite at this level policy wonkish, and people sat in rooms like this discussing high level issues. Actually, this stuff matters to the people that we represent, to working people up and down the country. And if I take anything from the Brexit vote that we saw in the UK a couple of years ago, is that we had far too many communities who just felt, you can tell me that GDP is growing, you can tell me that we got near enough full employment in parts of the country, but I do not feel the benefits of that economic growth in my pocket or in my communities, and people feeling very disconnected from those big debates about the future of the economy. So for me, it's about social dialogue, but it's also about making sure that that's consistent and it's broad, and it's not just reduced down to skills. Skills are important, but they're only one part of the picture.
And you mentioned there the role of unions in public-private collaboration and some of the limitations on trade unions in the UK. Obviously, every country is different, but there are more limitations on unions than there perhaps once were in a lot of developed countries. What can trade unions do, talking about leadership, to make sure that they're showing the leadership in what can sometimes be a difficult environment?
Well, I think we've shown it time and time again. If you think about the sectors in the UK economy that have done well since the financial crash, since 2008, two would stand out, two industrial sectors, automotive and aerospace, other sectors as well, maybe chemicals and so on. At the heart of those successful sectors has been the engagement of trade unions and the workforce. I mean, some really difficult conversations in the aftermath of that crash in 2008 about how do we balance keeping people in employment and increases in wages? How do we make sure if this plant is going to survive, it's going to need to re-equip more robots, not less. That means that people's jobs are going to change. In some cases, people aren't going to be carried on in the same roles. And I think actually what unions can help do is to mitigate that fear of new technology, mitigate the fear of change, can bring people on that journey with them. If you say to the workforce, we want to improve productivity, but there's going to be no benefit to you at the end of it, that's not a very compelling prospect. If you actually engage people in that process right at the outset, show them what it's going to mean to them and their job, show them how they're going to benefit from it, then that's a completely different conversation. So I see our role very much about making sure those legitimate concerns of the workforce are fed through, but also the expertise and the motivation of the workforce is fed into those debates as well.
And Alex, on this issue of kind of public and private and third and various sectors working together to tackle these big problems, what do people want to see? Who do they want to see take up leadership in these places? What do they expect from these different sectors? You know, sometimes we talk in these kinds of forums about public-private collaboration as if it's a sort of foregone conclusion. Sometimes voters have very different views of it. So what's your view of how the public see these kinds of things?
Okay, so a couple of things. So like 20% of our activity is with multilateral organizations and non-profits, and 80%, roughly speaking, is with big companies in different sectors, energy, telecom. When we work with them and when we analyze data for them, so one thing that is really interesting is that a lot of the times they have the same, and they share the same concerns. So they are concerned about the same issues and the impact of those issues in their businesses or in their workforce or in the ecosystems that they're plugging. More and more we see actually this type of collaborations that you are pointing out in Sodexo. We see a growing number of collaborations because more and more both the second sector and the third sector are realizing they're aligned in a common number of issues, normally global issues. So that's definitely one big trend. In terms of the individuals, the citizens, I was referring to this earlier. We see clearly a trend in which individuals are demanding companies, non-profits, large foundations, two things. One thing is to be faster than the governments sometimes. Or even to take the leading issues that they think are not well represented by the governments, or they're not well managed by the governments. And we see this in different forms. We see in the form of activism, digital activism, in the form of higher levels of commitment in terms of funding, supporting certain initiatives. This, by the way, comes, and we didn't talk about this, but I would love to bring that also to the table. This is also coming in a very particular scenario at the moment, because all these tools or these digital tools are under a lot of pressure because of disinformation. So we also see that a lot of people, it's at the same time that they use these tools, spreading fake news. Sometimes, spreading, theories that are, we believe, against everybody's interest. So we were talking before about Brexit. We have done a lot of work in terms of disinformation campaigns in Brexit. In the most recent Italian elections, we're now working in Latin America. So we also see how concerned people with good interest, also do bad things without even knowing and understanding the implications of their actions in the digital space. So, we live, I think, very interesting times, with a lot of possibilities and potential, but also with some threats that we all need to be aware of, I think.
I'm keen to open this up to the audience very shortly for questions, but one last one that I'm keen to get in, and anyone on the panel who wants to take it, feel free to put your hand up. We mentioned earlier that we don't have a representative from government on this panel, so I will be that representative. I'll say, what do we risk losing about the unique role of government, the unique contribution of government, if we emphasize too much about, lots of hands coming up, great, if we emphasize too much about the role of other global leaders? And I'm going to take Paul first, because he was gesticulating most wildly.
Democracy. I mean, our political systems are imperfect, our politicians are imperfect, but we do at least get to vote for them. And I think we need to be thinking about ways that we can support and supplement our democratic institutions rather than attempt to supplant them. There are different models of governance around the world. I'm not sure, some of them might be, people would argue, but from my point of view, and we've got a job to do to support government and the positive role that government plays. And I just run this back again to the debate around the European Union. It wasn't surprising to me. Politicians across the political spectrum in the UK spent the best part of 2 or 3 decades, whenever there was an unpopular political decision, say, it's been forced on us by Brussels, there's nothing we can do, it's all Brussels' fault. And then, fully enough, when we got to 2016 and you told people that they should vote to remain in the European Union, saying, aren't these the people that stopped us having a shipbuilding industry or you know, made us liberalise our telecoms, whatever. So I think we've got a job to do to talk up the role of government, to talk up the role of our democratic institutions, to strengthen them rather than try to replace them.
Deddy, you were waving at me as well.
Yeah, I think, and to your point, Paul, I think politicians and governments have the first responsibility to be role model. I think we all have to be role model in our responsibility. But role modeling is important if you want to create trust. I see government as having also an important role on incentivizing trends that are good for society. You know, typically, and you talked about Carillion earlier, Paul, when on public tenders, for example, when criteria for winning is lowest price, how do you ensure that you get good value for good money? And I think that as an incentive for better society overall, you know, in public tenders from governance, from local public authorities, we should think of having more weight from social and environmental performance criteria as award criteria than lowest price. I think governments also have a responsibility and a place to set standards and guardrails. And typically, I think on this topic, what happened last Friday with the GDPR, I think it's back to what you mentioned, the EU. I think it's one of the good things that the EU has come up with. It's strong regulation on data privacy and data protection, to your point, which will be paramount to our future, to the safe future. And we think that it's very good that we've been vocal and we're exemplary on that. The last point, and it will relate to what Paul and Frederic mentioned earlier, it's about pushing for change. In France, you know, in 2011, there has been a law called the Copé-Zimmermann law on the gender diversity at board level. And, you know, there was several years, okay, but today we see, you know, gender balance, more than 30% of women in boards. And I think it's very good. So there is a role for governments to strongly push for change. It's meaningful. It has an impact.
Did anyone else want? Yeah, Frederic.
Yeah, I think I don't like this phrase, but it's very true here. I think there is no alternative for governments but to work with us. However, I think the underlying question is not so much are they partnering with businesses, trade unions, NGOs, other non-state actors. The underlying question is the question of the citizen in that whole process. And of course, I mean, this is our very role, right, to mediate also and to make citizens' voices heard. But what is interesting today is that actually we have a way, or much more ways today, of involving the citizen directly and primarily through digital means, but not only. And I think that this is maybe the biggest challenge ahead, and maybe next year at this time of the year we will be discussing how to reinvent democracy here, and we probably should, because I think while we do have new opportunities, I don't think that first of all anyone has actually realized that we need to take the citizen seriously and really think about new ways of associating her and him to the process. But also the problem is that today there are obviously lots of risks linked to the digital revolution that Alex was actually referring to, and that we're not necessarily hearing all of them, or that we're actually only hearing something very biased. So first of all, are we hearing are we hearing those that are actually, for instance, defending the European Union, are defending democracy? And I think where we can be pretty certain we're not hearing from the one young woman in Niger that cannot even write. So I think that's maybe a question for another panel, but I think it's actually very much the underlying question of what we're discussing here. I mean, multilateral action, addressing global challenges, why are we doing this? it's for the good of the citizen, but do we actually know what the citizen wants, and are we actually giving him and her the right role in the process?
Alex, any very quick thoughts before we open it up?
Very quickly. I mean, the title of today, New Global Leadership. You get new stuff because you don't like the old stuff, right? So where I think this title is coming from, and part of our discussion today, is because there is a big misalignment between, you know, what citizens perceive as a priority and what governments perceive as a priority, both in terms of the speed that the issues are tackled, but also in terms of their priorities. I think that the governments need to bring the outside in. They need to, you know, listen more to citizens. They need to engage more. You know, in developed worlds, you know, people use Amazon Prime, you know. You get something in 2 hours at home. You buy instantly, you get it the next day. So people are now, you know, used to experiences, used to get feedback in real time, used to be responded almost in real time. And, you know, governments need to, in a way, understand that this is shifting the mind of the people they serve. And that creates a big gap in terms of perception, in terms of how everybody perceives the governments versus their daily experiences. So that, in terms, as I said, in speed, but also in terms of priorities and issues, is what is redefining new global leaderships. Because at the end of the day, it is the issues that you decide to tackle that also define you as a leader. And I think that's very important.
Okay, great. I'm going to open it up to the floor. We've got one over there. I'll take a few. If we could get a mic to this gentleman here in the green tie. Lady over here on the front right, as I'm looking. Is there any more? One more question for now. Okay, let's take those two first.
So I go first. I'm Marcello Palazzi. I represent the B Corps. That is a group of companies globally, Benefit Corporation, 2,500 companies working on impact. I want to say two things. One is there is a real movement about social entrepreneurs, social businesses. Actually, in France now, there is a movement called Entreprise en Mission, which is actually trying to create a group of mission-led companies. So a lot of these are young women all around the world working in microfinance, in health, in education, in food, in agriculture. So it would be great to have people like them on the panel next year, because they are really, you know, the new global leadership. They're combining purpose with entrepreneurship. So I just want to say that this is really happening. And also, it's kind of started with smaller companies now. We are working with Unilever. Danone has decided to become a B Corp. So big companies are also going into this path. So I wanted to say two concrete things. One is a CEO can also be someone in his 20s and a woman working in Bangladesh. So CEO is not only, you know, Denise Machuel or, you know, the typical CEO we imagine. Secondly, is about the trade unions. I think it would be very interesting for trade unions to do more around social entrepreneurship and actually helping intrapreneurs within companies have this kind of input agenda. So I think the world has actually moved on a lot, and there's a lot happening that should be part of this panel. Thank you.
So on social entrepreneurship, if anyone's interested in seeing a fantastic social entrepreneur, I can put in a plug for my boss, who's on a panel in about half an hour or so. Robin Scott, who's CEO of Apolitical. We're a mission-led business, so really interested to hear what you guys have to say about that. There was a question just over here.
Yes, maybe a question for Frédéric. I would be very happy to hear more about what you think about accountability in international cooperation. So we're talking a lot about renewing, reboosting international cooperation. What is the place of accountability? Can we link it to more commitment, legally binding commitment maybe? Is there a way to envision a more legally binding commitment in international cooperation? So just want to have your opinion on that.
Okay, one on social entrepreneurship, one on accountability in global corporations. Anyone want to leap forward? Yeah, Alex.
So on social entrepreneurship, you know, we are not a big company. We're, you know, heading towards 100 people in the next 12 months. Very much focused on data analytics. We do pro bono. We work with a lot of nonprofits because what we do is expensive. Data is expensive. And I think I see in a lot of my large clients very, very similar, you know, programs and attitudes. But overall, I think one of the biggest social impacts of any company, if it's focusing on the social impact or not, is actually providing jobs in our case, develop technology, moving technology forward, within Europe. I think that the social impact of a company is not linked to what they define as is going to be what they do and the impact is going to have. Just basically by, providing jobs, quality jobs, taking care of their employees, of their clients, being plugged into the ecosystem. I think any company is already delivering an immense social value that needs to be taken into account.
I'm going to come to Paul. Can I get a sense of how many more questions there are in the audience? Are there any more? Yeah, there's a couple more. All right, well, we'll come to Paul and then we'll...
I think the point about social entrepreneurship is really interesting, and particularly for those for low-income communities and communities that if I think about the UK, those towns that I talked about before, many of which voted Brexit, communities that deindustrialised 2 or 3 decades ago, and we haven't seen good quality employment come into those areas. And traditionally, the response of government has been to focus on either the Richard Branson type startups, the heroic entrepreneur, or on the other hand, spend a huge amount of money to bring in multinational inward investment. And I think there is something there about actually thinking about how you support local businesses. We commissioned, in response to the government publishing its industrial strategy, 3 reports about what industrial strategy would look like in different parts of the UK. And the report we produced for the northwest of England absolutely put social entrepreneurship and social enterprise at its heart, because actually there are lots of people in those communities who want to stay in those communities, make a positive impact in those communities, who aren't necessarily interested in creating the next FTSE 250 company, but who want to make a positive impact, earn a living, balance work and life. So absolutely a role there, I think. I should also declare an interest. My wife's doing a PhD on the subject and she submits on Thursday, so I've just read her dissertation.
And sorry, just to complement, I think we social entrepreneurs are a very good complement to what big corporations can do. And there's many things that we cannot do. And social entrepreneurs have a different business model that can be very complementary. We are, as we speak, Sodexo is speaking to social entrepreneurs in the north of France to build a full business model around urban farms whose product would be then spread across our reach. And so it's a very good complement between what social entrepreneurs can do with their business model and what we can do with our business model.
I know we had one last question over here. And is there room for one more? Oh, sorry, Frederic.
I mean, just on social entrepreneurship, this is why I was saying let's go beyond sectors, because now people came up with the term 4th sector. But maybe, we should just get rid of those boundaries. And on accountability in international cooperation, I think this is an incredibly important question also, because, as I said, we need to make progress, and we can only make progress if we have clear commitments and we can hold each other accountable for those commitments. And why we have the overarching framework of the Sustainable Development Goals, we actually need to fill it with life. The Paris Agreement is actually an interesting case, because, first of all, it did bring to a certain extent the citizen around the table, because, for instance, the agreement was negotiated in open data format. But then also there were commitments, especially also in the follow-up to the Paris Agreement, with the One Planet Summit coming, for instance, from businesses, other partners. I think this is actually the way to go. I think we need more agreements, at best binding agreements, to fill the Sustainable Development Agenda with life. But those commitments shouldn't come just from the public sector or from governments, but actually also from civil society, from businesses, from social businesses. And I think that this is probably one of the ways out of the, let's say, the situation we're in today with multilateral action. I was mentioning the G7 next year in France. The G7 has obviously lost a lot of legitimacy. I think it's a way of reviving this process, of giving it some sense, and as I said, it could be an interesting test case. And sorry, I'm just piggybacking on that question, but to do what? As I said, fill the Sustainable Development Agenda with life. I think actually what we need is actually especially some agreement that stretches across the sectors to make progress on gender, gender for everyone here in the room, but also for the one young woman in Niger I mentioned.
Okay, we're going to hear one last question from over here, and then I'm going to ask each of you to give an extremely swift, final, succinct, beautiful summation of your thoughts on the panel. But, sir.
Mohammed Yassin, is there any way for these new global leaders, these companies, to pledge and maybe nominate a third-party auditor to certify their pledge to devote part of their profit for these sustainable development goals or these good causes? Like we see governments have committed for the ODI, but they are not honoring it. Can these companies have play a leadership role by pledging and maybe having an oath on that?
So, whether responding to that question, to other questions, or to the panel, last thoughts, Paul.
Just the point I want to make is, the central point I would want to reinforce is that I think it is important that we support and supplement our democratic institutions. I think that's important in terms of if we are serious about inclusive growth, how we take citizens on that journey with us. And I think social dialogue has a really important role to play. Two very quick points. I'm a little bit cautious, Alex, in terms of I don't think the relationship between governments and citizens should be transactional. It's not an Amazon relationship, I want, you give. I think it's much more nuanced than that. And there is a real danger that those with the loudest digital voices are the ones that are heard. And I think Frederica made this point. It's probably a whole new panel in itself, but I'm interested in how we could use digital to empower citizens to act collectively, to raise their voices collectively, to make sure they can influence their government, to feel that connection with the democratic institutions.
Frederica.
Thanks for that perfect transition. Yeah, I think we won't be able to save the multilateral system and to address global challenges without citizens. And I think we're all first and foremost citizen. I mean, being as a CEO, as a business leader, as a trade union leader, as someone in civil society, but of course also you here in the audience. I think what we really need to do is to build a movement around the Sustainable Development Goals to actually ensure that by 2030 we don't have to talk about extreme poverty any longer, that we have found a way to manage climate change, that gender equality became reality, and this is what we are trying to do at One, but that loads of other actors are doing, and I hope we can continue the discussion, because I think it's just the start of a longer one.
Alex.
So my thoughts on the panel, basically, it's we need a new global leadership because we have new global issues. One thing that I like of the times we live in is that these new challenges, these global challenges, are more and more the same for non-profits, multilateral organizations, and companies. And I think it all comes down to citizens willing to see things happening faster, so speed, and with more transparency. So I think that is putting pressure on the governments. I simplify this by saying that the governments also need to be digitally transformed, in the sense of going at the same speed, or at least the perceived speed of the citizens. I was not saying before that the relationships need to be transactional. I'm just saying that the mind of the consumers, the mind of the citizens, the mind of the individuals, the stakeholders, is also shaped by the daily experiences, and that I have the ability to provide instant feedback to any business through internet, for example, or to get stuff delivered to my doorstep almost instantly. And I think that is the kind of relationship that people will want with any other stakeholder into the ecosystem. But overall, I think that what we do, which is basically data analytics of the public sphere, which is bringing the outside inside, whether it's a government or a non-profit or a company, it's becoming more and more relevant in order to close the gap between where people believe the priorities are and where they really are for the ones deciding.
And Denis, very final thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. To your point, I think new leadership means that in the future we need to be more and more authentic, more and more transparent. as leaders, of course in corporations, but across, the whole, trade unions, NGOs, governments. Transparency, authenticity, I think is the key for the future. Second thing is, I think as CEO, we have to take into account that the sustainability of our company cannot be viewed only from a pure, again, P&L, profit and share price perspective. And it's because we will be inclusive, it's because we'll be able to engage dialogue with other stakeholders that we will reinforce our future as a company. And that requires, as a leader, to ensure that with the whole company, people are ready to engage different dialogues with different kinds of people, different kinds of stakeholders. And, Sodexo being a people company, employing, a lot of people, the first responsibility is to care for people, to care for their future. And I would like just take one sentence that was great in this initial video that we saw. For us as leaders, think about other people before you think about yourself.
Great. What a way to end the panel. Let's have a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you all very much for coming.
trabajando por eso además.